Welcome to this breakout session, Fighting Deregulation to Secure a Stronger, Healthier Economy. I'm David Dayen, the executive editor of the American Prospect. I'll be moderating this panel. And I have to say that I've never been a fan of the term deregulation, and I'll explain why. If we're talking about regulation as the structuring of markets, the setting up of rules for citizens to follow, then there's always regulation. The question is who gets to determine it. We're either going to have regulation determined by elected representatives through a democracy, or we'll transfer that market structuring and standard setting to corporate executives and shareholders. We don't really deregulate so much as we kick regulation upstairs to C-suites. And when framed that way as you know, regulation by democracy or regulation by corporatocracy, you know, as whether you and the representatives you elect get to decide whether your air and water is clean or whether you're safe on the job, or whether that decision is made by a CEO trying to maximize the bottom line, I think the stark choice becomes a lot clearer. When we give away the power to regulate, we end up with inadequate working conditions, unstable financial markets prone to collapse, degraded health access, communities at risk, consolidated corporate power, and corporate impunity, and as we've seen the last few days, a planet on fire. So we're going to look at the consequences of these choices and what can be done about them with a great group of panelists. You know, maybe for expediency's sake, you can look up on the internets who these folks are. I'll briefly introduce them as I begin the questioning. And I think we'll start with Andrea Flynn from the Maven Collaborative. You know, the one thing I've been thinking about with respect to healthcare, the largest employer of physicians in the country now is United Healthcare, an insurance company. The largest pharmacy chain, CVS, is also a pharmacy benefit manager, which is supposed to be a middleman in between pharmacy chains and health plans. It also has an insurance company attached to it, and it's also doing, through the Minute Clinics, actual providing of healthcare. How has this consolidation really, how does it affect equitable access? How does it affect price? How does it affect quality in the healthcare space? And how can regulation play into this very deep consolidation in healthcare?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that very small question. Happy to see all of you today. I do think this is such an important question, and you know what we've seen is consolidation in like every direction, right, of the healthcare sector, as you just mentioned. And so I want to touch on a few reasons why that is deeply problematic and inequitable. And I think I'll tell the story maybe through the consolidation of hospitals, which we can then extrapolate and think about how this broader consolidation story you're telling is really harmful. You know, so in addition to what, David, what you just talked about, right, we've seen over the last 3 decades or so this really incredibly fast consolidation of healthcare providers across the country, right? So what we've seen is these bigger hospital companies buying up smaller hospital companies, buying up small mom and pop shops, family providers. And so what we've seen is this incredibly rapid loss of community-based providers. And the story that we're told is often that this consolidation will lead to more efficient healthcare, that it will lead to better healthcare, better services for patients. And we now have really robust data to show that that is just absolutely not true, that the only people who are winning in this story of I would say non-regulation and consolidation and privatization are the people who are making money off the system, that it is just a losing proposition for patients. And And of course, the patients who are hurt the most are patients in Black and brown communities. And when we talk about losing a community provider, we're talking about losing providers sometimes who families have relied on for generations, right? Trusted providers. And it's not so easy just to jump over to the new doctor. And often that means you're actually just losing access to healthcare in your community. So there are three parts of this story that I think are important, and I'll tell quickly. Then I hope you'll take away. One is that the story is bad for workers, and three, that I think we need to think about it in the broader political context, social political context that we're living in. As I just mentioned, right, the data shows that patient outcomes are just not better. And in fact, one of the things that's happened over the past few decades in the story of consolidation is that private companies have been buying up public hospitals. There's been a 40% reduction in public hospitals over the last 4 decades, and there's a lot of data to show how that really boosts profits for private healthcare companies, and we now have data to show that the losers in that situation are uninsured patients and patients on Medicaid, that the way those companies boost profits and ensure profits is to basically make sure that people who are not profitable don't have access to care. And we know that Black and brown folks in this country are disproportionately covered by those systems, disproportionately without insurance. So I just want to be really clear that that is part of the strategy of how to make these institutions profitable, is by taking healthcare away from people who need it the most. The second part, bad for workers, right? I think sometimes in this story of what's happening to our healthcare sector, we forget about the people who are working in it. We talk a lot about how people are impacted as patients, and we forget that those same people are also workers in the health system, right? And so what we see is that jobs are shed, full-time employment positions go down in a consolidated healthcare market, that the quality of work also goes down, and that there's a real decrease in unionized jobs. Public hospitals are more than 2 times as likely as private hospitals to be unionized. And I want us all to really think about how segregated the labor market is in the healthcare sector. We know that Black and brown women in particular are channeled into the lowest paid, most unsafe, dangerous, unstable jobs in this sector. And so we don't have to imagine too much what that would look like when those workers lose the protection of a union and are moved into a more consolidated sector where they lose worker power. And the last piece that I think is really important that I really don't see us talking about is the context this is happening in. And I think we cannot talk about hospital consolidation absent the context of what we are seeing in a post-Dobbs environment. And for those of us who have worked in the repro space for a long time, this environment has been going on for a lot longer since before last June when Dobbs was decided. But we know the story, right, of loss of community providers that I just told, but that's happening in a context where conservative politicians have waged an incredibly effective attack on community health providers who are providing full spectrum reproductive health care to communities that really have nowhere else to go for care. So we have seen this very strategic, effective erosion of the reproductive health safety net over the country over the last decade, and that has had an incredibly acute impact on Black women, on communities of color, on young people, on the LGBTQ community, and on immigrant patients. And that has sort of been this quiet erosion, and now we are in a post-Dobbs environment where clinics are closing very rapidly. Those clinics don't only provide abortion, right? Abortion clinics don't only provide abortion. They provide full spectrum healthcare. So when an abortion clinic closes, people who have been going to that clinic for a long time for all sorts of healthcare lose their provider. And now we are seeing that physicians are not wanting to move to states that are already low on providers because they are afraid of what will happen to them if they provide care in the way they've been trained to. So right? This is all part of the same political economic strategy. We talk about it differently. Conservatives don't think about these as different stories. It's all part of the same strategy. So I think we just need to recognize that.
Thanks. I mean, this is happening in a world where the markets are structured in such a way in that you're talking about an area that's 1/6 of the U.S. economy. Much of the money is coming from the public sector, but the conditions and the standards are not being met at that sort of, you know, starting point to ensure equitable access. Very interesting. So I'm going to go to Renita now. The last one of the last panels that I moderated was at South by Southwest, and it was part of their tech festival, and it was the day of the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, that Friday, and there were people in the audience who were tech startups, people making wire transfers frantically on their phones. During this wave, there was like this fierce rebuke from bank lobbyists, and the whole idea that deregulation had nothing to do with this. This was a black swan event, a once-in-a-lifetime event. They didn't want to talk about the fact that there was this bipartisan rollback in 2018 of bank regulation that played a significant role. Could you explain how this led to a lighter touch and supervision, and also like the way in which it created sort of a mindset around a hands-off approach to regulation and supervision?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question, David. Yeah, as you said, there's been a lot of mental gymnastics being played by, frankly, kind of both sides across the political spectrum about how this bill, everyone refers to it as S2155, economic regulatory relief growth. I'm actually blanking on the full ridiculous name.
I call it the Crapo bill,
yeah.
Because the author of it was a guy named Mike Crapo, and
yeah.
it also describes the substance
yeah.
of the bill.
Regulatory relief, indeed. So yes, the idea stemmed, you know, we had, and this was literally done on the 10th anniversary of the Dodd-Frank bill that was passed, which was a landmark, as many of you know, a landmark reform bill after the 2008 crisis, financial crisis, to really shore up the banking system and coming at the recognition that, you know, to your earlier point, David, that these banks have been playing by the rules that they've created at the expense of everyone else. And a massive lobbying push by quote-unquote community banks. And I want to be very specific when I say what's considered community banks, because per Dodd-Frank, 50 billion, any bank that with 50 billion in assets and above, you know, they were subjected to enhanced prudential rules, which are like higher capital requirements to cushion any losses that you may, you know, a bank may have, any higher liquidity, which is just the idea of, you know, your cash on hand, and if you are facing sudden, you know, pressures, you are able to liquidate really quickly to give, you know, folks like you and I cash when we come running for it. You know, stress testing, you know, which was one of the novel things created after via Dodd-Frank, that lets simulate harsh economic environments and see how the banks will fare in such environments, and, you know, and then there will be some rules. Maybe you stop, you can't do a stock buyback, you have to like pause on your dividend payments to shareholders. So all of this came out of Dodd-Frank, and then we have this bill, 2018, the Crapo bill, the S2155, whatever, regulatory relief bill, that really says, oh no, 50 billion, that is, that's actually probably a community bank. Let's raise the threshold to 250. And from 100 to 250, we're gonna give the Fed the ability to, you know, we're gonna give them what's known as tailoring, or, you know, they're subject, the Fed is subject to figure out the rules for the banks between 100 to 250,000. And then we see this massive, right, like Greg Becker, the CEO of SVB, well, former CEO, is in front of Congress, Signature Bank, and their chairman is in front of Congress saying like, we want this, like, give this to us. And then you see this massive explosion of growth from these banks these size. And think about it, at the time, 2008 financial crisis, Washington Mutual failed, Countrywide failed, and all of these banks, even though they're not the size of JP Morgan or Bank of America, they still had significant impacts on the economy. And it's like 10 years later, you know, we forgot all of that and said, well, actually, these are really small banks. And literally, I think officials from the Federal Reserve are like, there is no systemic risk to the system from these banks. And, you know, fast forward now, we learned our lesson. It didn't even take that long. What is this, 5 years later? We see exactly what folks predicted, that there will be a massive growth in the among these regional banks, quote unquote regional banks, and really lax requirements. So, you know, again, not subject to stress testing, not subject to higher capital requirements. There was this, basically legislators gave the Fed the idea and other regulators that, you know what, these banks, like as David said, let's give them a lighter touch. I think even when they are subject to stress testing, it's like every 2 to 3 years. And if they grow to meet the threshold that they then need to be subjected, there's still a gap period of like another year. So massive like exemptions of rules. Supervisors at the regulatory banks, at the regional Federal Reserve and like regional FDIC offices are all given really a signal coming from Congress and being watered down that these banks are of less risk. And let's remember who was in office at the time, Donald Trump and his homies. One of them, being, I probably won't call names, but we know who was the vice chair of supervision at the time at the Fed, and literally said, we need to streamline the supervision process for these banks. And we see what happen, and even now, what has happened, and even now, there's lots of propaganda out there to say, no, with social media, these runs, what can we do about people trading money on social media or sending messages to now a 6-hour bank run? This is novel. Well, maybe if they had capital and liquidity requirements, social media wouldn't matter. Then, well, it was the supervisor's fault and incompetent executives, which, there's some truth to that. But to deny the fact that over and over, and we could trace it from Glass-Steagall, we could trace it to, Brooksley Born, and who was the CFTC commissioner during the Clinton administration, who called out over-the-counter derivatives way before the subprime mortgage crisis. We keep running the same play and then surprised every time when the financial system, blows up. And I just want to add one point to Andrea, if you don't mind, David. But, the villain in all of that too is, again, the financial system and private equity, and a lot of these banks through their M&A, merger and acquisition activity, really driving, even right now, I think today in Politico, the bank lobby again saying, well, the administration is quelling M&A activity, and we're scared to do anything there, and really helping to drive some comments throughout the administration that probably the way to solve these bank mergers and these crises is through additional bank mergers. So you want to consolidate more to solve what's happening? So private equity has been, Aspen Dental, US Dermatology, they're really extracting business, and we see this in the healthcare sector, we see this in the banking sector, and it's a story as old as time, and I'll end there.
Thank you. Just building on that, to go to Alex Beckmann with the Transportation Trades Department, I think a perfect example of how regulation, in this case in the transportation sector, has been shifted to the investor class, to Wall Street, is this whole concept, which maybe you can explain, of precision scheduled railroading, which maybe you could explain, how the impact of what was the impact of that in the supply chain crisis, in the kinds of actions like the derailment we saw in East Palestine earlier this year. What is precision scheduled railroading, and what is its effect?
Sure. Thanks, David, and great to see you all, and thanks for coming out on this Friday. So I'm from the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. We have 13 rail unions that affiliate with us, representing every single Class 1 freight rail worker, which are the freight rail workers that work for the large freight railroads. So railroads, as you've probably seen, have been in the news last year. And I think, the fundamental story, as David was alluding to, and my other panelists have spoken so far, is about how corporate greed, and specifically the influence of Wall Street and the financial sector, has basically poisoned in the industry. In this case, what they poisoned is the railroad industry. So I think it's fair to say the railroad industry right now is the picture of corporate greed. They've made, since 2015, over $160 billion with a B. It's their highest nominal profits ever, even more than when they were called the robber barons back in the late 19th century. So this industry is making as much money as they've ever have in the history of this country. Simultaneously, they have laid off, since 2015, over 30% of their workforce, 45,000 workers. They've just cut 30% of the workers, and they've spent more on stock buybacks, over $165 billion for their investors, than they've even invested in their own infrastructure. So they're not there to run a railroad. They're there right now to give money back to their shareholders. And where this came from is, as David was talking about, this term called precision scheduled railroading, which labor calls so-called precision scheduled railroading because it's neither precise nor scheduled when it comes to railroad operations, is about the mid-2010s, Wall Street decided that the railroads, which were doing fine profit-wise, generally running, doing okay. There's always going to be issues between management and labor, but things are generally going okay. Wall Street and a hedge fund known as Pershing Capital from Bill Ackman decided they weren't happy with the amount of money they were making. And so they found an industry executive by the name of Hunter Harrison who was willing to cut to the bone, literally do anything to make more money as possible. And the way they were going to do that was not growing the business or, finding more customers. They were going to cut costs. Every dime. Didn't matter what it was, they were going to do it. And so what we've seen over the last 8 to 10 years is sort of railroads one by one, sort of keeping up with the Jones effect, implementing this new operating model, which is what David refers to it's called precision scheduled railroading. It's the euphemism the railroads use. What it should be called is making money at the expense of everything else, including safety and workers, is they've cut anywhere possible. So they've laid off 45,000 workers. They've gotten rid of locomotives, rail yards, everything you need to operate as a business to provide rail service, they've cut. And so when the pandemic hit, the railroads were not prepared. Their whole operating model is based on everything going right every single time. So no worker calls out sick. There's no bad weather on their network. There's no wildfires in Canada. Obviously that doesn't happen. Renita was talking about stress tests. If you stress test the railroads, which we actually think is a good idea, they would fail. There's no resiliency in the system. They got rid of all the resiliency and then cut into the bone. And so when the global pandemic hit, the biggest cause in the transportation sector on the supply chain crisis was actually the railroads. It wasn't the ports, it wasn't the trucking sector. Those sectors have problems, but it was the railroads. And so I think, we all probably remember the visual images, off of LA and Port of LA and Long Beach of all those ships backed up. It actually wasn't principally the ships. The problem was the ports couldn't put the cargo on the railroads to move it out because the railroads didn't have literally enough locomotives or workers or equipment. And so the cargo just kept getting stacked up and the ships couldn't come into the ports to offload it because the railroads couldn't move the goods. And the reason this has happened is because of the lack of economic and safety guardrails around the system. There's a separate economic regulator for the railroads. It's called the Surface Transportation Board. It was sort of, up until recently, was asleep at the wheel for decades. Didn't really, regulate the industry that much, sort of let the railroads do whatever the railroads wanted. And so what happened was when Wall Street came in, and Pershing Capital and Bill Ackman and others, they basically found economic regulators not paying attention, safety regulators not paying attention. And the railroads are allowed to do whatever they want. And so what's resulted is a system that doesn't work for anyone but the railroads and their investors. So let's talk about safety just briefly, as David was pointing out. I assume everyone saw the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio in early February. That's traumatized that town and residents forever. The sort of sad thing about it is twofold. One, it was preventable. If there were the proper safety protocols and regulations in place, absolutely that derailment could have been prevented. And two, that wasn't anormal. You know, that train wasn't different than trains that the railroads run every day, and not just Norfolk Southern, which was the train operator operating it. Norfolk Southern is not worse than the other big railroads. Could have happened in any community in the country. Could have happened out west. Could have happened, you know, in the south. And it's precisely because this precision scheduled railroading operating model has poisoned the entire industry as each railroad has faced pressure from Wall Street to adopt it and make as much money as possible. So what we need is sort of twofold. On the safety front, we actually need to put in safety regulations so the railroads don't find every way to cut back on safety, which is what they're doing now. They're cutting everywhere they can cut on the safety front, they are. So I'll give you a couple examples that, you know, are I think are mind-boggling to the average American. There are no minimum requirements for the amount of people you need to run a train. Absolutely none. So about 2 to 3 decades ago, we generally had 6 people on a train, 6 crew members operating it. We're now down to 2. If the railroads had their way, that would be 1, and I assume in the future they'd want to automate it too. So these trains can be up to 2, 3, 4, and in some places out west, 5 miles long. There are 2 members operating that train. The railroads would like to have 1. Those trains also carry hazardous materials. So the one on East Palestine was carrying vinyl chloride. There are much worse things carried on the railroad, things like chlorine, even nuclear waste. Again, the railroads don't really care. They want to find as much money as possible. So what we need, and thankfully what the Biden administration has proposed, is a minimum crew size requirement. You need to have at least 2 qualified members on a train. Common sense, right? Many states, including Republican systems, passed it. Probably won't come as a shock. The railroads are fighting that tooth and nail. They absolutely hate it. Costs them money. Actually, the ironic part is it wouldn't cost them any more now because they have 2 people. It just would prevent them from cutting and saving more in the future. And you need people on a train to prevent it from derailing. The railroads don't care. They're just looking, hey, how can I make more money next quarter? Well, biggest cost is people. I can eliminate 1/2 of my cost. The second thing, which in some ways might even be more nuts. Like a lot of transportation or any sort of sector, we do inspections to make sure that the rail equipment that we're running doesn't have defects. Kind of bad if you have defects when you're running trains. Well, the railroad operating model depends on them running trains as fast as possible. They want to keep things moving. So they're not really concerned about safety. They want to get the rail cars out the door. So they have told workers, hey, you have 1 minute to inspect a rail car. Do like 200 different inspection points. And by the way, you have 200 of these rail cars to inspect and you got 1 minute per. And if you don't inspect it in 1 minute, you're fired. There are no minimum federal safety regulations on the amount of time a worker is required to be given to inspect a rail car or a rail locomotive. There's not even a prohibition on the railroads establishing maximum time. So it's not illegal for them to be like, you have 15 seconds or 30 seconds. They can pick. It's entirely up to the railroad. And it's no wonder then that we believe the train that derailed in East Palestine had a defect that probably the rail worker who was really stressed out and overworked didn't have time to find. And the safety equipment the railroad should have had was not functioning properly. And so the train derailed. And that town is traumatized and the residents are traumatized for decades to come, if not for the rest of that life of that town. And I think that just sort of sums up where the industry is and the pernicious influence that's come from Wall Street. It's an industry that doesn't care about its workers. It doesn't care about the communities that it operates in. And the only way we're going to prevent that is by having strong safety and economic regulations. Otherwise, Wall Street will continue to push boundaries and say, hey, you got to make more money. And so that's where we need, strong economic regulation, and that's where we need, strong safety regulations, and happy to get into that more too.
Great, thanks. So, we're hearing about these 3 separate industries, healthcare, transportation and rail, financial services. And we're hearing about these deficiencies in regulation or deliberate deficiencies. And you may be wondering how this can happen. So now we're going to take a tour with Sabeel deep into the weeds of regulatory policy. Sabeel, you served as the head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Services, is that right? Or Affairs, OIRA. It's sort of the regulator of the regulators. And I'm going to let you describe this what this agency does, what it has historically, what it was set up to do, which is really to be put in a role of as a gatekeeper for regulation, and how under the Biden administration, under in part your leadership, it has transformed into more of a facilitator for regulation.
Yeah, thanks, David. And so appreciate all my colleagues on the panel here. And I think before I get into the weeds for a moment, just to dial it back for a second, I mean, it's so powerful to hear each of you talk about, reproductive justice, healthcare, financial regulation, training infrastructure, because I think a common through line for all of this, right, is if you dial it back, these are all like the lifeblood, the basic infrastructures we need as a country and as communities to thrive, right? Health, finance, physical infrastructure, and we could keep adding to the list. And so when conservatives talk about, deregulation is a freedom, it's exactly backwards, right? Because actually freedom requires those protections for workers, for communities, those basic, the access to those basic things that we all need. And that's where a strong, robust state comes in. The conservative project of deregulation is about freedom for a particular set of folks, right? The freedom for the shareholders, or the freedom to exploit. And that's not what we want. So David mentioned I spent my last couple of years in the administration working on in the Regulatory Affairs Office. And so really quickly, what OIRA does is we coordinate. Well, I shouldn't say we anymore. They coordinate the executive branch's regulatory policy. So every significant regulatory action, rulemaking, a lot of the grant programs will flow through OIRA and the Office of Management and Budget for final review and clearance. And so some of that is on the analysis and on the law. Some of that is a kind of intra-government approval and peer review process. Does are EPA and DOT on the same page about how to handle electric vehicles? Is the White House on the same page with the agency? But you can already see just the way that's set up, kind of as David said, it's a really important gatekeeper node, sort of kind of critical part of the process. It's the last stop on the policymaking train. A big part of what our objective was going in the administration is on day one, in the suite of day one executive orders that the president put out on equity, on climate, later on competition and so forth. One of the day one actions was to modernize regulatory review. Very wonky, but the charge was for our office to rethink the way we analyze and review regulations, specifically to make sure we're taking into account values of human dignity, the kind of long-term effects across generations of climate, health, equity and civil liberties, right? There's a whole list of things that basically the task was to make sure that we're not overlooking those values because they may not show up, on a ledger or on a balance sheet. And so that was something that we took really seriously. And in February, the administration put out its proposed rewrite of what's called Circular A4. Hasn't been rewritten since the W. Bush administration, and a new executive order on regulations. All of which is to say, I think a big part of the progressive project is not just getting the policies right and doing the organizing we need to win those policies, but also getting the machinery of government to execute on all that. Because I think another through line in all the stories that I hope everyone heard is you actually need a lot of people, and government is full of incredibly talented, dedicated folks who are trying to do the right thing, but we are coming off of 40 years of austerity politics, cutting budgets. When we came in at the start of the administration, at the height of the pandemic, we didn't even have the resources to backfill, hire career staff who had left because of holdups from prior Congresses. So it's really hard, right, to write all the rules and to do all the kind of enforcement that we need without also building a machinery that is dedicated to this work. I think the last thing I'll say quickly is every major moment of progressive advance, whether it's the New Deal, whether it's the first Reconstruction in the 1860s, 1870s, and the second Reconstruction of the 1960s, in part turned on the creation of new instrumentalities of public power. The DOJ has its origins in Reconstruction, right? The voting rights enforcement apparatus and the civil rights apparatus coming out of the 1960s, the FTC coming out of the antitrust progressive era, and then even the CFPB, right, coming out of Dodd-Frank. This is a big part of what we need to do as progressives, and I think it's really important, sort of part of the project of this group. Thank you,
Spiel. I'm going to do one more round, then we'll get to questions. So I think it's important, Andrea, to talk about some of what Sabeel has just brought out in the context and get specific on how regulation works maybe in the health sector. You know, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, for example, the way that they rate hospitals, the way that they rate nursing homes, like the STAR system that they use, which is largely self-generated by the nursing homes themselves, is a function of manpower, and it's a function also of just sort of the mindset, I think, of the way that the regulatory apparatus views its role. What other examples of that do you see in healthcare, and where do you think the regulatory apparatus could go further?
Thanks for that. So I love what Sabeel was just saying about how we measure the impact of some of these regulations. And I think, right, like, who are we centering when we think about what's going to happen when this healthcare market becomes consolidated for like the 10th time? Like, what does that mean for women who are pregnant, right? In this we are one of the only countries in the world where the maternal mortality rate has increased. That is also a story, I mean, that is a story of systemic racism and sexism, but it is also a story of a failed health system. And so, right, what does it mean to consolidate healthcare what kind of health system do we need to build to make sure that Black women can have babies and that they can live and be healthy, and that their children can live and be healthy? And that is just so far from how we have usually thought about, right, like measuring should this merger happen or not. So I think this, like, right, being human-centered and really thinking about who is hurting the most from these system failures. And the other thing, I think we need to think about regulating spaces that we have not previously regulated. So, you know, what we've seen in the past decade is this incredible proliferation of what are known as crisis pregnancy centers. They are fake healthcare centers. They outnumber real abortion facilities, pre-Dobbs 3-to-1 in Texas. They outnumber reproductive health clinics 9-to-1. They are paid for in large part by public dollars. 29 states in this country use TANF funding to pay for crisis pregnancy centers, and I just want to be really clear, that means they're taking money that is used to keep women and families healthy and pushing it into organizations that are meant to lie and deceive pregnant women, and they are completely unregulated. And they're unregulated because they are not real medical facilities. So the measures or indicators that would normally be used to regulate these facilities don't count. So, you know, one big thing that a lot of us have been worried about is because they're not real health facilities, that means they don't have to abide by HIPAA, which means that in this highly politicized, dangerous environment, patients are going in thinking that they're getting real health care, and now these entities that have no regulation around privacy have access to your pregnancy data, your personal privacy information, and they can give it to anybody they want. So I think, right, there are these new kinds of organizations in this current political environment that have historically, right, we need to think differently and bigger.
Yeah. And you think of the flip side of that, which is the targeted regulation of abortion providers that you see in the States, which is like using regulation as a weapon to wield against facilities that you know, facilitate reproductive justice. Renita, one thing we see in the financial services sector always is a race between what is called innovation and regulation. I think I've heard that the SEC budget in its entirety is about equal to the budget of the legal department at JP Morgan Chase. Just one bank, or a big one, but one bank. So this week the SEC sued Binance and Coinbase in a bid to essentially shut down the market for digital assets, to try to bring them under a control that they essentially don't want to be in, to say that these tokens should be registered as securities. You could talk about that, or maybe other areas of innovation what is called innovation, where regulators should be taking a close look as this race between innovation and regulation continues.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. And it occurred to me, I should have said that I'm with Americans for Financial Reform, an advocacy group stemming out of the financial crisis that had a major role to play, yes, in the creation of the CFPB. So now you know who I am. But yes, well, going back to your fact on the SEC's budget, if that scares you, the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission budget is about, what? Not quarter, but significantly less than the SEC's budget, and they regulate a far bigger market than the securities, all of futures, derivatives, well, commodity derivatives, and what is it, $16 trillion market,
Yes,
I believe.
I mean, notionally, hundreds of trillions of dollars. Yeah.
So if the SEC scares you, let's also fund that agency. But to your original question, yeah, we are seeing, the advance of digital assets, again, stemming from the idea of thinking of a lot of places lacking in our financial system, like the fact that we don't have, for example, real-time payments, which a lot of countries do, that we have to wait 2 to 3 days, if not longer, for our checks to clear. And a lot of this stems from the fact, again, that the people who have been calling the shots are the biggest Wall Street players, creating a financial system that works for them at the expense of everyone else. So now we have, private actors coming in the form of, crypto, which has been taking up a lot of time in my life, and I imagine others, to fill these gaps. Well, people want fast payments. People want electronic payments. Like, let's make private money. Like, we didn't already have this in the 1800s. And one of the biggest things that the industry touts is the fact that, Black and brown people are trading these instruments and are using it, and it's giving them access to the financial system, which, they have been blocked out traditionally. And on one hand, that is, it is true that Black and brown folks have been, as a lot of us have detailed today, have been left out on purpose from the traditional financial system. I don't know if creating private money is the way to do so, is the way to give them access, or maybe just having, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, the OCC, Treasury, get better at its jobs. So we have an industry that's saying, again, we are innovative. Look at what the distributed ledger and all the fancy words that they throw at us that I won't bore you with right now, saying that this is the future of money and finance. And we see, both on the left and on the right, more so on the right, to be fair, people really buying into this and saying, because you're innovative and you are, doing cool things, let's carve you out from rules. And actually, let's create a whole nother set of rules for you because you are, quote unquote, providing innovative technologies. When really what you're doing is just creating another instrument for people to trade speculatively and creating a massive asset bubble. And then the people who have been traditionally left out the system, who, yes, are indeed using these products because we lack the adequate consumer protection. And I buy Dogecoin, for example, and then Elon Musk is pumping it up on social media, and then, on Saturday Night Live, when he decides he doesn't care about it anymore, it says something bad, and now, the value of said Dogecoin is in the dirt. What happens to me then? Or I pour half my life savings into, Ethereum or whatever other coin that's being traded, and again, the people that's really benefiting are, again, these institutional actors, and the consumers, the people that they tout that they care about, are left eating the dirt. And again, we fall for the same arguments, right? Like, where are the consumer protection? They're writing bills right now as we speak, and literally, at least 1 or 2 drafts do not even mention consumer protection. They don't mention basic things. If you are holding money and people are supposed to be you're saying that this money is equal to $1 at par. If I want to take it out, you're supposed to have something in the reserve so that to keep that dollar equal to the value of $1, right? Like you hold some type of securities, and there's nothing saying that they have to do any of this. So it's really, I think we need to stay vigilant. I think, the one thing I will say, and I'll close, is that the Biden administration, he has, with the slate of nominees he's pulled into the financial sector, with Lina Khan, with Tim Wu, with, Tim Wu has left now, with Rohit Chopra, has recognized this, and they are actively speaking out and calling out the industry for a lot of their nonsense. But it is something that I think all of us in this room continually have to fight between this idea that innovation means that you should be regulated less.
Thank you. I guess we got 5 minutes till Q&A. I'm going to try to squeeze a couple more questions in here. Alex, you were talking about what we need in terms of rail. We did see Congress pass the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, one of the first re-regulations of a key industrial sector since the Cable Act of 1992. It has more teeth for the Federal Maritime Commission, minimum service standards for shipping contracts, reasonable fees, things like that. And yet, that same Congress, when it came to rail, and particularly the rail workers' strike, decided to use the Railway Labor Act to essentially end that strike and put forward a mediated contract that did not include sick days, for example. Do you think that there is public utility regulation that could be applied to the rail sector, other parts of the transportation sector, in a way that mirrors what was so successful in the ocean shipping context, and how do you think we can get there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and sort of I think the short answer is yes, and I think it leads into one of the points I hope you take away is you sort of hear the challenges, not only in the rail industry, but healthcare and the financial industry and everything that Ohio is working at. Is I think we all agree on sort of the common problems here, too much corporate greed, concentration, lack of regulation, but the solutions need to be sort of uniquely tailored to each industry. Mm-hmm. So what might work in healthcare may not work in, the financial industry, and may, not work in the railroad. So for example, the barriers to competition in the railroad industry, is David's question about sort of utility style reform, is really high. You and I are not going to go out and form a railroad tomorrow that's going to go out and provide service, right? So, where we are today, we're down to 2 big railroads in the western half of the United States and 2 big railroads in the eastern half of the United States. It's really duopoly. And so, in some ways, the antitrust fight is sort of lost where we are in this moment. That was when the railroads were being, a lot of mergers in the 80s and 90s. That's when that fight was happening. And sadly, the economic regulator at the time was asleep at the wheel. Labor expressed a lot of concerns about sort of how this was going, and unfortunately, those concerns were not as heated as much as they probably should have, and now we're here in this day with 2 in the west and 2 in the east. So I think that sort of just reinforces what David was asking about, which is we need to put in basic standards for all the railroads. We're not going to find someone else to come in and compete and raise the level. It really comes down to the economic regulator, which in this case is an independent agency called the Surface Transportation Board. I'm saddened to say I think its budget is much less than the SEC and Commodities Future Trading Commission, and we're talking about an industry here that makes billions of dollars a year. So a little bit of a David versus Goliath fight for sure. But giving the Surface Transportation Board, more tools in the toolbox to say to each of the railroads, hey, you are a duopoly. Let's acknowledge the reality of the situation. It's likely not going to change. We're not going to come in and see a brand new railroad coming in and taking over. So you need to provide, good service to your customers. The safety regulator needs to, in this case, it's a separate entity which causes problems, but the Federal Railroad Administration, which is part of the United States Department of Transportation, needs to set basic safety standards. So to get a little wonky here for just briefly, when we went through this fight back in the day, late 19th, early 20th century, the country basically told the railroads, hey, you have to provide service to everyone that wanted it. So I guess similar to sort of the healthcare challenges we heard about, the railroads were shying away from providing service to folks they didn't want to provide service to. So they're now required to, it's called their common carrier obligation, which is in federal law, do what's called provide reasonable service at reasonable rates, and I put quotations around reasonable. Those are not, as the Surface Transportation Board has had a hard time, sort of figuring out how to apply that. And so what we're pushing strongly for is to say, hey, that means specific things. That means you can say you have to have a certain amount of workers to provide the service that you need. You can't cut 45,000 workers. It means you have to have the locomotives necessary to run the trains or have the equipment available, neither of which they have now. I think it means things like implementing stress tests to say what happens if there's bad weather. Does your rail network have the ability to still provide service when things go wrong? I love the idea that we instituted in Dodd-Frank on the financial side. I think it would work great for the regulator to say, are you prepared when things go wrong? Because inevitably it will, and you need to be able to meet those challenges. They don't have any of those tools available to them right now. And I think that's one of, going back to how pernicious pressure from Wall Street finds cracks and crevices. We need to fill those and put in guardrails, and that means getting the economic regulator, in this case, the STB, the ability to do that. So I just want to emphasize there are going to be different solutions for these three sectors and everything else. In some sectors it might be saying, hey, we don't want further mergers. I think we're beyond that point in the rail sector. I think where we are is we need to put in baseline standards for every single of the big four and sort of do more utility style regulation versus trying to figure out, how do we bring in, different competition, because that's just realistically not going to happen at this point.
Literally, there was a merger between Canadian Pacific and Casey Southern just this year. Okay, I wanted to squeeze in one more question for Sabeel, but I'll get it through while we ask questions of the audience. Who do we got? Right here. And I guess I'm supposed to wait for a mic? Yes, okay.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Sarah Prey. I'm lucky enough to be a colleague of Renita's and American for Financial Reform, Americans. So when I saw this title, Fighting Deregulation to Secure a Stronger and Healthier Economy, the first thing I thought of was the judicial assault on regulatory authority, and how are we as advocates and Americans going to handle the fact that there's an unrelenting desire from the judiciary, especially those appointed during Trump's presidency, to erode as much authority from regulators as possible. So when you have an unaccountable, for the most part, and authority that doesn't sort of respond to the same tactics that, say, legislators or even regulators or other members of the administration, what do we do?
Huge question. And Sabeel, since I missed you before, I'm going to see if you can answer that.
No, I'm so glad you raised that, Sarah, because I was on my mind, too, to sort of highlight. And for folks who may not be following this as much, if you haven't heard the words major questions doctrine yet, you will soon. Between a bunch of big cases on COVID, on climate, I'm quite nervous about what's going to happen with the student debt case any day now. The CFPB sort of lurking in there. I think Sarah's exactly right. There is a concerted assault on the regulatory state from the court, but not just like regulation in general. It's specifically the kinds of regulations that are advancing this vision for the country, right? Climate, economics, racial justice, worker safety. So that's happening, and I think it's also, Director Young this morning was also talking about sort of what the House Republicans are pressing for. Little noticed, there was a brief moment where in the debt ceiling negotiations, the House Republicans also tried to slip in provisions that would have required Congress to affirmatively vote yes on every major regulation that any agency puts forth. It's called the REINS Act. That was thankfully stripped out. But as she said, they're going to keep trying. So we're not just up against kind of corporate actors, we're also up against sort of an assault from the legal side. I think, I know we've got to move quickly. So two things I'd say. One is that I don't think the court is actually immune to public pressure. It shows up in different ways. The court's switch in time in 1937, I think, has quite a bit to do with the public pressure they were under, in the Roosevelt era. And so I think at a minimum, there should be a public reckoning every time the court makes a decision that quite literally throws people back on the streets in the middle of a pandemic, makes it more likely that hundreds of thousands of people are going to die from, poor air quality, you name the thing. So I think that's really important. Our normal tools of public persuasion, organizing, advocacy are incredibly important. I think the second thing is that there's no way we get to the kinds of things we want without a larger conversation about court reform. That just has to be part of our lexicon. A lot of liberals are not as comfortable with that. And then lastly, we have to keep pressing the advantage. It matters to get people who understand corporate concentration on the court. It matters to get people who understand racial justice and racial equity and who have lived in communities, who have been public defenders or have been community organizers in those positions to make the judiciary more like us.
Can I just add to that one thing is that the notion that Congress has power in this arena? In the debt limit deal, what they replaced the REINS Act with was this thing called administrative pay-go, where every regulation that that costs mandatory spending money has to be offset with by taking away a regulation that also costs money. And that's in the bill. However, what they added, Congress, is that the OMB director, who we all saw speak earlier, has the ability to waive that provision, very broad waiver authority, and in the bill it says the courts cannot review any decision of OMB in that arena. So there is jurisdiction stripping within that particular piece of legislation. And, Congress should just copy-paste that into pretty much everything they do. We have a very expansive judicial review in this country, and Congress has been given the authority to tailor that review in ways that they see fit, and I think they need to use it more. Yeah, back here. Yeah.
So Sabeel was just talking a little bit about how important it is to have organizers and people being mobilized into the streets. So I guess my orientation is primarily as an organizer and as a policy wonk, but really thinking primarily about what ideas do each of you have in your particular areas of expertise and in the industries you're looking at to generate the countervailing power against the forces of deregulation? Because I think right now what we're constantly doing is playing defense, and we see it all over in every major industry, and we aren't necessarily putting forward ideas to build the necessary worker, tenant, people, community power to do that. And what are the policy ideas or regulatory ideas that you have to do that in your particular cases?
Great question. We'll go down the line. We'll start with Alex.
So since I work for the AFL-CIO, I'll put a plug in here for labor unions. And maybe this is where I want to at least give some folks a sense of optimism, because I think you heard a lot of sort of problems to be solved. But we've been here before in the rail space. Post-Civil War, rail corporations were sort of the first big corporations that came about in this country, and I think caused a necessary sea change in how this country operates. So the first labor unions, at least the oldest one in North America, is actually one of ours. It's the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineer and Trainmen. They were called a different name back then, part of the Teamsters, but they were formed in 1863. And pretty much all the freight rail workers today for the big freight railroads are unionized, and that's because they went through these fights in the 19th and 20th century and found out the only way that they would be able to fight back was to actually organize and form unions. And so the history, a lot of the early labor history in the 19th century comes in the rail space. You have massive, events like the Pullman strike of 1893. Eugene Debs trying to organize a lot of the rail workers. And I think rail shows the power of organizing and the power of unions. Just to use a quick example here in modern day of where I become optimistic, as David was alluding to, the big issue last year in the contract fight between the unions and the railroads was the lack of paid sick time. So before this latest round of negotiations, only about 5% of rail workers had any days of paid sick time, even though they had been asking for decades. The railroads adamantly refused. They were not going to negotiate on paid sick time. They, at least in the public eye, they lost that fight. I know Congress is a different story, but they lost that fight in the public eye. And because of the organizing and that our unions have done and the solidarity from you all and fellow unions, fellow progressive activists, the railroads have actually been forced to negotiate with our unions on paid sick time since the beginning of this year. So we're now up to 60% of rail workers that have paid sick leave. We're on track to hopefully get 100% of over 100,000 rail workers at least 4 days of paid sick time. It's not perfect. We want to get up to 7. There's some issues to work through. But I'll just want to sort of emphasize this. I've had my union representatives come in and tell me when they go into union halls and tell, grown men, very tough men that have been on the railroad, that they get a paid sick day, 4 days of paid sick time, they're tears. It's that transformational for union workers that they finally get paid sick time after decades of fighting. It is going to change their lives. I'm confident it's going to save lives. Folks will be able to go to cancer screenings or medical appointments, and that will save lives. And that's what the solidarity that, our unions, the progressive, community, the fight that we've had about the railroad, it can be done. We did it in the 19th and 20th century. We're doing it now. And so for all the problems we've had, up here, I remain optimistic because of what I'm seeing now going on in the rail industry and the fight to get all the workers that I represent paid sick time.
Thank you for the message of hope and optimism on this panel.
So I think that on the healthcare front, Jamila was saying yesterday, we've seen advocacy on healthcare actually decline, and we're seeing, less advocacy and attention to this space than we've seen in a decade or so. But when we've seen real fights against the ACA, it was advocacy that actually saved it. And I think, there are a million things wrong with the ACA. I could write a few books about it. But it made our really, really, really shitty system better. And we've done a really bad job talking about how it's done that. And so, there's a talk about the attacks on the regulatory state. There's a case coming out of Texas right now that is threatening the very body that came up with preventive services requirement, which dramatically elevated the floor of coverage. It means you don't have to pay when you go, get your mammogram or get your birth control or get your annual screening, things that keep us alive. Keep us from getting sick. And there is a really concentrated attack on the very body that's coming up with those recommendations, and really no one's talking about it. But that provision is incredibly popular. No one wants to lose that coverage. So I do think, being able to talk about what we've done and how it's improved things, even when it's not enough, we can't lose what we have, We need to build on it and make it better. And we've seen that people really mobilize around this issue and can help us hold the line. And so I do think we're in a moment where that's incredibly important.
Great.
Just final thoughts here.
This is great. I mean, I think, I hope our collective thinking will get us further along, it's one of the reasons why EconCon is so great. I think a few things I'll just add is, one is telling the common through line that connects all the dots, because we even here, we talked about it with different sectors, but it's all hitting the same folks. As as an organizer, as humans and as communities, we're living all parts of this, and finding ways to tell the broader story of what people are experiencing in a way that connects the dots, so that what we think of as, we have to fight this fight on the ACA, but we also have to fight this fight on finance. It's actually all the same fight, because it's the same people who are trying to screw over the same people for the same reasons. And so there's a little bit of just let's make it really simple. Number one. I think number two is I think our sector. Our ecosystem, can get a lot better at navigating the regulatory arena as well as we navigate the electoral and legislative arena. It's just wonky and different, and we can talk much more about that offline, but I think that's muscle building that we've been doing really well, but need to do a lot more of. And then the last thing is, when it comes to policy advocacy, so David mentioned this, what we could put in the bills, there's a lot of ways, the next time we're able to pass legislation, there are a bunch of ways that we could write into that legislation, community boards and different ways, kind of hooks for organizing, different ways that communities actually can have decisional impact on these really wonky technical things, as part of what the CFPB is so powerful at, It sort of creates that hub in finance. How do we do that in these other spaces? So as we, incubate policy for the next governing moment, I hope we do more of that.
And we did that to an extent in the IRA and CHIPS, and you see the administration do that in implementation. Renee, we'll leave it with you. So final words.
Taking from your earlier comments, David, about who is setting the agenda, who is structuring these markets, these industries, if we're going to leave it to the private sector, if we're going to leave it to government. And I think all of us should take a step back. I don't know if this will answer your question as neatly as you would like, But the way how we talk about government, and Sibyl, you mentioned it earlier, like, government is a force of good, and I don't think we talk about it, even, some of us progressive on the left, as much. There are really lots of talented people in government, right? Like, I geek out and like read some of these things, for example, from NOAA, like our weather service, the numbers that you see on your iPhone every day on like what the weather is going to be, that comes from NOAA within the Commerce Department, right? Like if you're lost at sea, there is literally someone that will find you, that has a guy who has tested how far different sizes of objects travel at sea with different like wind variants, right? And we don't talk, if we want people to think about, to realize that regulation, right? Because I think even some of us, right, like on the left, we hear that and we think of it as a dirty word, or like government is getting too big. Like politicians are running for office and their favorite thing is to like crap all over DC and the swamp and like this whole ecosystem. But this ecosystem keeps us alive and tells us what temperature you should cook your meat at so you don't have food poisoning and salmonella and like this whole, so I really do think, and it comes from like, the birth of our country in a way, but like from all sides, there needs to be a revisioning of what is the place of government in our lives and what it actually does, because we only really talk about it when they're screwing up and they're not doing, they're doing something bad, that's when they're in the news, but on a minute-by-minute basis, there are so many examples of things that government does well and like just keeps us running, and I think for us to even get to the point where the public is realizing like we need more and not less, us too, of how we talk and when we're advising politics, there just needs to be a complete rethink. And I'm sorry, I don't know the step-by-steps and how to get there, but I do know we need to get there, and I'm a fan of government, so yes.
Great. Thank you for that. We're going to leave it there. Great summing up. Thanks to the incredible people on this panel. And I believe it's time for lunch. So let's go.